European fantasy creatures do not belong in African fantasy stories. Since fantasy is made-up stories, you can add anything to your African fantasy story. But the lack of originality may lead to accusations that your story is European fantasy in blackface. So, here we go. These are 5 creatures that do not belong in African fantasy. The first creature you should not include is the elf. Yes, I went there. I recognize the infatuation European fantasy writers have with elves. They're supposed to be graceful, peaceful, beautiful, and wise. Elves live in beautiful cities, but human beings keep creating problems for them. These creatures do not exist in the folktales in the African continent, and I think it's best to keep them out of your fantasy story. Be prepared for accusations of cultural appropriation if you do keep them in your stories. Now, I'm not saying that there are no creatures that are similar to elves in African folktales. If you want me to talk about creatures similar to elves in African fantasy, just leave a comment. Another creature that you shouldn't include, and I'm going to get in trouble for this, are dragons. Are there creatures that could be described as dragon-like in African fantasy? Yes, but in a similar way that a horse can be compared to a zebra. Take for example the Ninking Nanka, which is a West African creature many claim is a dragon. Many call it a dragon, but it lives in swampy areas. It could be a fish-like monster rather than a dragon. You see, Asian dragons are often either nature gods or spirits that are full of wisdom. European dragons lust for gold and power and can be violent. Both European and Asian dragons can fly, but only European dragons need wings. No creature bearing these kinds of descriptions is found in African folktales. Now, don't hate me for this, but vampires are not an African concept. There is a creature in East Africa that looks like a bat. However, it is actually a succubus rather than a vampire. In West Africa, some cultures talk about human secret societies that imbibe human blood in the night, but they are not vampires. There is a blood-sucking moth-like creature called Adze in Ghanaian folktales. Remember that vampires are human-like creatures that thrive on human blood. The modern conception of vampires is based on 18th century stories from southeastern Europe. Of course, the concept of vampires existed long before that. Unicorns, which are mono-horned horses that have some magical attributes such as healing and water purifying abilities, are also not in African mythology or folktales. These creatures have an enchanting aura that makes them a favorite for kings and powerful men in many European folktales. The fact that they are not in African mythology or folktales is not difficult to understand, because in ancient Africa, horses were present only in few regions because of sassaflies. Another creature you will not find in African fantasy is the werewolf. Now, werewolves are shape-shifting humans who turn into wolf-like creatures during the full moon. They are depicted in the media as massive wolf-like creatures with a devastating bite. African mythology and folktales have shape-shifting humans, but no werewolves. Remember, wolves do not exist in the African continent. Now, I do not belong to the board of African fantasy, And I am not the supreme leader of African fantasy. All I am saying is that create stories that fit into the African landscape. Don't borrow too much from European sources when writing African fiction if you want your story to feel original. Anyway, if you like the video, please subscribe and hit the bell button. See you next time.